Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Before we begin, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Not literally, of course, since you're watching this, but I want you to imagine something. Imagine the very first second of existence. Not the first second of your life or the first second of human history, but the first second of everything. The moment when time itself drew its very first breath, when matter and energy crashed into one another with a violence so total that it created every atom, every photon, every scrap of physical law that would ever govern the universe. Now imagine that in that unimaginable explosion, in that blinding storm of creation, something woke up. Not a creature in any sense you or I would recognize, but a consciousness, a thinking presence wrapped in the plasma of newborn stars, a feeding on the electromagnetic fires of suns that had not yet finished forming. These beings did not have names. They did not need them. They were older than language, older than planets, older than the concept of a species. They were simply there, vast and patient, and utterly indifferent to anything that was not starlight and solar fire. They drifted among the stars, the way a fish drifts through the ocean, natural and effortless, consuming the energy of their stellar hosts and moving on when one star dimmed and another flared to life. They had no ambitions, they had no cruelty, they had no morality at all, because morality requires a mind capable of recognizing other minds, and these entities could barely perceive the material world beyond the nuclear furnaces they called home. These were the Citan, the star gods, the Ingir, as the Eldari would later name them, in whispered dread. And they were about to become the most terrible force the galaxy had ever known. Not because they chose to be, not at first, but because something came along and showed them what they were missing. Something gave them bodies and appetites and egos, and in doing so, unleashed horrors that would scar the galaxy for 60 million years and counting. This is their story. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most disturbing and profound tales in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Because the story of the Citan is not just a story about powerful aliens or ancient wars. It is a story about what happens when beings of limitless power discover cruelty. It is a story about what happens when gods learn to hunger. And it is a story about the price that every civilization in the galaxy is still paying, tens of millions of years later, for a bargain made in desperation by a dying race that did not understand what it was unleashing. So settle in, get comfortable. Because we are going all the way back to the beginning, past the Imperium, past the Eldari, past every civilization that has ever risen and fallen across the breadth of this galaxy, to an era so ancient that the light from its stars has long since faded into the background radiation of the cosmos. We are going back to the birth of everything, and we are going to meet the oldest monsters in existence. Let me start with what the Citan actually were before the galaxy learned to fear them, because there is something deeply unsettling about the fact that these entities, all which would go on to cause suffering on a scale that defies mortal comprehension, began their existence as something almost peaceful, almost innocent, if you can apply that word to a being the size of a star. In the very earliest moments of the universe, as hydrogen clouds condensed and ignited into the first generation of stars, the Citan coalesced from the raw energies of creation itself. They were not born in the biological sense. They did not have parents or childhoods or any developmental process that we would recognize. They simply emerged, woven from the electromagnetic fields and plasma currents of newborn suns, like patterns forming in the surface of a river. Each Citan was unique in its configuration, but all shared certain fundamental characteristics. They were beings of pure energy, spread across the surface of their host stars in vast, gossamer-thin lattices of electromagnetic force. They fed on stellar radiation, absorbing the output of their suns the way a plant absorbs sunlight. And this feeding shortened the lives of those stars by uncounted millennia. In a sense, They were parasites, but parasites on such a grand scale and over such incomprehensible time spans that the word loses most of its meaning. Think about that for a moment. A being so vast that it wraps itself around an entire star. A consciousness so ancient that it watched galaxies form and spiral arms take shape. A life form so fundamentally alien that the concept of a planet, let alone a creature living on one, was utterly beneath its notice. The matter swirling around the stars the Citan fed upon, as the dust that would eventually coalesce into worlds and moons and asteroids, was so insignificant to them that it simply did not register. They could no more perceive a planet than you could perceive a single bacterium on the surface of the ocean. As eons passed, the Citan developed what might charitably be called wings. Though that word is absurdly inadequate, they fashioned extensions of themselves from the lines of electromagnetic force that permeated the void, and they used these structures to travel between stars. When one sun began to dim, drained of too much energy by its parasitic guest, the Citan would unfurl these diaphanous appendages of magnetic flux and drift across the black gulf to find a new host. It was a cycle that had repeated billions of times across billions of years, and it might have continued forever if the Citan had been left alone. They were not aggressive, they were not malevolent, they were simply hungry in the most basic, elemental sense, and the universe was full of food. But they were not left alone, because somewhere in the galaxy, on a world orbiting a star that blazed with hateful, cancer-causing radiation, a race of short-lived, bitter, resentful creatures was looking up at the sky and cursing the very sun that gave them life. These creatures were called the Necrontyr, and their encounter with the Citan would change the galaxy forever. To understand the Citan, you first need to understand the Necrontyr, because the star gods did not become monsters on their own. They were made into monsters, shaped and directed, and ultimately betrayed by the very beings who first gave them form. And the Necrontyr, in turn, were shaped by their own suffering into exactly the kind of people who would make a deal with a cosmic predator and call it salvation. The Necrontyr arose on a world that hated them from the moment they drew their first breath. Their home star was a bloated, unstable thing that bathed their planet in such intense and harmful radiation that every Necrontyr who ever lived did so under a death sentence written in their own DNA. Their lifespans were brutally short, cut down by cancers and cellular degradation caused by the very light that warmed their world. Every Necrontyr knew, from the moment they were old enough to understand the concept, that they were going to die young, that their bodies were going to betray them, and that no amount of medicine or technology or prayer could fully shield them from the baleful influence of the star that burned above them like a malicious eye. This shaped their entire civilization in ways that are hard to overstate. The Necrontyr became obsessed with death, not in the morbid, fatalistic way that some human cultures have been, but with a burning, resentful fury that colored every aspect of their society. They built monuments to the dead that dwarfed their cities. They developed elaborate funerary rituals that consumed more resources than their living citizens ever enjoyed. They studied their own sun with an intensity that bordered on worship, trying desperately to understand the force that was killing them, hoping against hope that understanding might bring some measure of control. And they spread outward. Driven by the need to escape their poisoned homeworld, the Necrontyr colonized other systems with a determination born of desperation. They built vast interstellar empires, connected by torch ships crafted from a remarkable substance called necrodermis, a form of living metal that could reshape itself according to the needs of its users. They were brilliant engineers and scientists, their technology driven forward by the simple necessity of survival. But no matter how far they spread, no matter how many worlds they claimed, they could not escape the fundamental unfairness of their existence. Because the galaxy was not empty when the Necrontyr ventured out among the stars. There were other civilizations out there, older and more powerful and blessed with advantages that the Necrontyr could only dream of. Chief among these were the Old Ones, a race of beings so ancient and so powerful that they had been old when the Necrontyr's sun was young. The Old Ones were masters of the warp, that parallel dimension of psychic energy that underlies physical reality. They had used their mastery to develop technologies that seemed like magic, including the webway, a network of extra-dimensional tunnels that allowed them to travel instantly across the galaxy without ever entering the dangerous currents of the warp itself. And here is where the Necrontyr's resentment curdled into something truly dangerous. Because the Old Ones possessed something that the Necrontyr wanted more than anything else in the universe. The Old Ones were functionally immortal. They did not age. They did not sicken. So they did not waste away under the radiation of a hateful star while watching their children develop tumors before they had learned to walk. The Old Ones had the gift of eternal life, and when the Necrontyr begged them to share it, the Old Ones refused. Now, the reasons for this refusal are lost to history. Perhaps the Old Ones had good reasons. Perhaps the technology could not be transferred. Perhaps they looked at the Necrontyr's bitterness and aggression and decided that immortality in the hands of such a species would be a disaster for the galaxy. Whatever the reason, the refusal burned in the hearts of the Necrontyr like acid. It transformed their sorrow into hatred and their desperation into fury. If the Old Ones would not share their gift willingly, then the Necrontyr would take it by force. The first war in heaven began, and it was a disaster for the Necrontyr. The Old Ones were simply too powerful, their mastery of the warp too complete, their technology too advanced. The Necrontyr fought with everything they had, throwing their armies and their fleets against the Old Ones' defenses with the reckless courage of the doomed, and they were crushed. Driven back to the halo stars at the galaxy's edge, reduced from a mighty empire to scattered remnants clinging to existence in the outer darkness, the Necrontyr faced extinction. Their unity, such as it was, shattered. The various Necrontyr dynasties turned on one another in what are known as the Wars of Secession, fighting over what little remained of their once great civilization. The ruling Triarch, the Council of Three Pharaons who governed the entire species, desperately searched for something, anything, that could reunify their fractured people and give them a chance against the Old Ones. And then they found it. Or rather, it found them. Remember those Necrontyr scientists who had spent generations studying their own hateful sun? Their research had not been wasted. Over centuries of painstaking observation, they had detected something extraordinary in the dying stars they studied. Unusual electrodynamic anomalies, patterns in the plasma that suggested intelligence, self-awareness, life of a kind that no one had ever imagined. They had found the Catan. The precise circumstances of the first contact between the Necrontyr and the Catan are disputed. The dusty archives of the tomb world of Solemnace claim it was an accident, a chance discovery made by a stellar probe investigating a dying star. The Aeldari text, known as the Book of Mournful Night, held in the innermost vaults of the Black Library, tells a different story entirely. It claims that the raw hatred the Necrontyr felt for the Old Ones sang out across space like a beacon, a frequency of pure resentment that the Catan could not ignore. Whether it was science or spite that drew them together, the result was the same. The first Catan to make contact with the Necrontyr was the entity that fed upon their very own sun, the being that had been slowly killing them for their entire existence as a species, the creature whose radiation had cursed them with their short, cancer-ridden lives. This entity would later be given many names: Azagorod, Kaelis Ra, the destroyer of light. But the name that would echo through 60 million years of history, the name that would become synonymous with death itself across 1,000 species and 1,000,000 worlds, was simply this: the Nightbringer. The Necrontyr understood that these energy beings could not interact with the material universe in any meaningful way without physical forms. They were vast, yes, and powerful beyond measure, but they were also diffuse, spread across the surfaces of stars in patterns too tenuous to affect the solid matter that made up the rest of reality. So the Necrontyre did something that would alter the course of galactic history forever. They built bodies for the C'tan. Using their mastery of necrodermis, that remarkable living metal that could reshape itself according to need, the Necrontyre crafted physical shells designed to contain the C'tan's vast energies. These bodies were works of extraordinary engineering, containers capable of holding thousands of miles of energy creature compressed into a form that could walk and speak and interact with the material world. The Necrontyre shaped these shells to resemble the half-forgotten gods of their own mythology, perhaps hoping to establish a connection between their religious traditions and these newly embodied cosmic entities. Then came the transfer. Across what Aeldari legends call an incorporeal starlight bridge, translucent streamers of electromagnetic force shifted through the void as the C'tan coiled themselves into their new bodies. The process was beautiful, according to those fragmentary accounts that survive, like watching auroras fold themselves into the shape of gods. But beauty, in this galaxy, has always been the mask that horror wears. Oh, when the Nightbringer entered its necrodermis body and experienced the material universe for the first time, something changed. Something fundamental and irreversible. For billions of years, the C'tan had fed on nothing but starlight and electromagnetic radiation, a diet that was bland and flavorless compared to what it now discovered. Because the moment the Nightbringer became aware of the Necrontyre, the moment it perceived living beings for the first time through its new physical senses, it discovered something intoxicating. It discovered that the electromagnetic energy given off by living creatures, particularly by creatures experiencing strong emotions, tasted infinitely better than the output of any star. And what emotions produce the strongest electromagnetic signatures? Fear, pain, the desperate, but animal terror of a being that knows it is about to die. The Nightbringer began to feed, not on stars, but on the Necrontyre themselves. It slaughtered them, gorging itself on their terror and their suffering, with an ecstasy that it had never known in its billions of years of stellar existence. The Necrontyre who had summoned it, who had built its body, who had hoped it would be their salvation, died screaming as their god consumed them. Only through desperate pledges of servitude were the remaining Necrontyre able to convince the Nightbringer to stop. They promised it that there were other species, beyond number, scattered across the galaxy, each one a potential feast far richer than anything the Necrontyre alone could provide. The Nightbringer, sated for the moment but already hungry again, agreed to spare its creators on the condition that they serve as its instruments of destruction. The Necrontyre, with no other options and everything to lose, accepted. And then they woke the others. One by one, the Necrontyre sought out more C'tan dwelling in the dying stars of the galaxy and offered them the same gift: necrodermis bodies, physical form, and a universe full of creatures to consume. Each C'tan that crossed the Starlight Bridge underwent the same transformation as the Nightbringer, exchanging the bland sustenance of stellar energy for the rich, addictive flavor of mortal life force. And each one, upon tasting that new diet for the first time, became something fundamentally different from what it had been before. The C'tan developed egos. They developed preferences and grudges and ambitions. They developed cruelty, and a concept that had been meaningless to them when they were simply patterns of energy drifting across the surface of a star. They became, in the truest and most terrible sense of the word, gods. Not benevolent gods, not protective gods, but predator gods, hunter gods. Gods who looked upon the teeming life of the galaxy and saw nothing but an endless buffet. Among these newly awakened deities, one stood apart from the others, not because it was the strongest or the most ancient, but because it was the cleverest. While the Nightbringer reveled in slaughter and the other C'tan gloried in their newfound power, this particular entity had recognized something that its brethren had not: It understood that raw power was less useful than influence, that a whispered suggestion could accomplish more than a thunderbolt, and that the greatest victories were the ones your enemy did not realize they had lost. Its name was Mephetran. The Necrontyr called it the Messenger, because it seemed to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine more easily than any other Citan. It was charming where the others were terrifying, persuasive where they were commanding, and endlessly patient. It gathered followers not through fear, but through charisma, amassing the largest base of devoted worshippers among all the Citan, despite being one of the weakest in terms of raw power. It even sent some of its own followers to serve other Citan, gifts meant to curry favor and build alliances. But among its own kind, Mephetran was known by a different name, a name that the Necrontyr would not learn until it was far, far too late. They called it the Deceiver. And it was the Deceiver who would seal the fate of the Necrontyr forever. The Deceiver came before the ruling Triarch of the Necrontyr, before the Silent King Sarek himself, and it spoke with honeyed words and half-truths. It told the Necrontyr of an ancient war between the Citan and the Old Ones, a conflict that had taken place long before the Necrontyr even existed. It claimed that the Citan had lost that war and been forced into hiding, and that now, with the Necrontyr's help, they could finally achieve vengeance against their mutual enemy. But the Deceiver offered more than just alliance. It offered something that struck at the very heart of the Necrontyr's deepest and most painful desire. It offered immortality. The process was called biotransference. The Citan would provide the technology to transfer Necrontyr consciousness out of their frail, cancer-ridden biological bodies and into new shells made of necrodermis, the same living metal that formed the Citan's own physical forms. No more short lifespans, no more radiation sickness, no more watching your children die before they reached adulthood. Every Necrontyr, from the lowliest worker to the mightiest pharaoh, would be granted eternal life in a body that would never age, never sicken, never fail. It was the answer to every prayer the Necrontyr had ever uttered. It was everything they had ever wanted. And some among the Necrontyr saw the trap for what it was. Orican, the brilliant astromancer who would later be known as the Diviner, warned that the Deceiver's promises came at a cost that was not being disclosed. He sensed deception in the Citan's words, shadows lurking behind the bright promises of immortality, but his warnings went unheeded. The pain of the Necrontyr's existence was too great, and the hope offered by biotransference too intoxicating for caution to prevail. Even the dissenters were dealt with. The Deceiver was nothing if not thorough. Those who opposed biotransference were lured into the clutches of the faithful through promises of mediation and compromise. One particularly insidious deception involved a figure named Nephrith, supposedly the last natural pharaoh of the Amunos dynasty, who was said to be immune to the cancers that plagued the species. Nephrith became a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for those who believed that the Necrontyr could find another way. But Nephrith was a lie. The seemingly disease-free leader was in fact a discarded fragment of the Deceiver itself, a puppet designed to draw out opponents of biotransference and deliver them to their fate. One by one, the resistors were identified, isolated, and fed into the furnaces alongside everyone else. The biotransference began. By order of the Silent King, every Necrontyr was to submit to the great biofurnaces. The nobility went first, stepping willingly into the blazing crucibles, where their flesh would be stripped away and replaced with metal. Those who resisted were carried to the furnaces by force, their limbs broken by ghost arcs, their protests silenced by the mechanical efficiency of the process itself. And above each furnace, the Citans swooped and dove in their ethereal true forms, drinking in the spiritual and electromagnetic energy that poured from the Necrontyr as their bodies were destroyed and their consciousness was transferred. Because that was the real purpose of biotransference, the price that the Deceiver had so carefully concealed. The process did not simply transfer the Necrontyr into new bodies. It stripped them of their souls. Every necrontire who entered the bio-furnace emerged as something less than what they had been. Their memories remained, at least for the strongest among them. Their knowledge and skills survived the transfer. But the essence of who they were, the spark of consciousness that made them more than just biological machines, was consumed by the Citan as fuel. When the Silent King himself emerged from biotransference and looked upon what had become of his people, yet the full horror of what he had done struck him like a physical blow. He felt it immediately, a terrible emptiness gnawing at his mind, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. In that moment, Zarek knew with cold certainty that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of his soul. The Necrontyr were gone. In their place stood the Necrons, immortal, unified, and utterly soulless. The Citan had fulfilled their promises in the most technical and most cruel sense. The Necrons were immortal. They would never age. They would never sicken. But the overwhelming majority of the species had been reduced to mindless automata, their personalities and free will consumed along with their souls. Only the very strongest among the nobility retained their intellect and self-awareness. And even they were shadows of their former selves, stripped of so much of what had made them individuals. And now, the Citan had what they really wanted, an army of billions of perfectly obedient soldiers who would fight and die and fight again without question, without fear, without any of the messy emotional complications that made organic troops so unreliable. The Necrons were the perfect tools of conquest, and the Citan meant to use them to feed on every living thing in the galaxy. The second phase of the war in heaven had begun, and this time, the Old Ones were on the losing side, armed with weapons of unimaginable power and starships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye through quantum phase technology. The combined forces of the Citan and the Necrons fell upon the Old Ones with a fury that beggared description. More planets were razed, suns were extinguished, entire star systems were devoured by black holes summoned into existence by the reality-warping powers of the star gods. The Old Ones, for all their mastery of the warp, could not stand against beings who were the masters of physical reality itself. Because that is the crucial thing to understand about the Citan. Their power is not psychic. It does not come from the warp. The Citan are, in fact, completely disconnected from the Imperium. The warp is anathema to them, a dimension they cannot enter or control, a force they cannot wield or even fully comprehend. But within the material universe, within the realm of physical law and material reality, the Citan are supreme. They can manipulate matter and energy at the most fundamental level. They can bend time and space. They can summon antimatter, create singularities, and reshape the very fabric of reality according to their will. These are not psychic powers. These are expressions of what happens when a being born from the fundamental forces of the universe decides to exercise its authority over those forces. Against such power, the Old Ones were forced to desperate measures. They had always relied on the warp as their primary tool, and now they turned to it with renewed urgency. They began to genetically engineer new species, races designed with stronger psychic connections to the warp, hoping to create soldiers who could channel enough psychic energy to threaten the Citan. Among these created species were the ancestors of the Eldari, beings of extraordinary psychic potential, who would go on to become one of the galaxy's dominant civilizations. They also created the Krork, massive and warlike creatures who were the precursors to the orcs of the 41st millennium. Other races were crafted and unleashed, the Rashan, the Canib, and countless others whose names have been lost to the depths of time. But even as the Old Ones marshaled their defenses, something was happening among the Citan that would prove just as destructive as anything they could do to each other. The star gods were turning on one another. It began, as so many catastrophes do, with a whisper. The deceiver, that master of manipulation, that weaver of lies so subtle they could reshape the destiny of civilizations, turned its talents inward. It whispered to the Nightbringer, to the other great Citan, telling them something that was both absolutely true and absolutely devastating. And it told them that the life energy of other Citan was the sweetest feast of all, and the Nightbringer, that bottomless pit of hunger and cruelty, listened. What followed was a period of such catastrophic infighting that it nearly destroyed the Citan from within. The greatest among them began to hunt and consume the lesser, absorbing their energy and growing more powerful with each meal. The Nightbringer was the worst offender, devouring Citan after Citan with an appetite that could never be satisfied. But it was far from the only one. The outsider, another of the great Citan, was also tricked into consuming its brethren, though in its case the deception came not from the deceiver alone, but also from Chegarach, the laughing god of the Aeldari Harlequins, who saw an opportunity to weaken the star gods from within. Planets were raised in the crossfire, stars were extinguished by the clashing energies of warring gods. Whole systems were consumed by the black holes and gravitational anomalies that erupted whenever two Citan turned their reality-warping powers against each other. The galaxy became a charnel house, caught between the Old Ones and their created races on one side, and the self-destructing pantheon of star gods on the other. Meanwhile, the psychic warfare unleashed by the Old Ones' created races was having its own terrible consequences. The intense psychic activity generated by the young races, combined with the unimaginable suffering caused by the war, was destabilizing the warp itself. The Imperium, that parallel dimension of thought and emotion, was being churned into a frenzy by the psychic screams of billions of dying creatures. Dark things began to stir in its depths. Malevolent entities coalesced from the accumulated anguish of the war, predatory intelligences that would eventually become something far worse than anything the galaxy had yet experienced. And then came the enslavers. These were warp-spawned creatures that emerged into reality through the minds of psychers, taking control of their hosts and using them to create portals through which more of their kind could pour. The enslaver plague swept across the galaxy like wildfire, infesting world after world, turning the Old Ones' own psychic creations against them. It was the final blow. The Old Ones, already reeling from the combined assault of the Citan, the Necrons, and the internecine war among the star gods, could not survive this new threat. They were destroyed, their civilization collapsing into ruin and their surviving members either fleeing the galaxy entirely or hiding themselves away in places so remote that they have never been found. The Citan had won the war in heaven, but their victory was hollow, because the galaxy they had fought to dominate was now a shattered wasteland, its populations decimated by war and plague, its stars dimmed by the feeding of insatiable gods. And the living harvests that the Citan depended on for sustenance were growing thin. It was in this moment of exhaustion and vulnerability that the Silent King made his move. Zarek had been waiting. Through all the long millennia of the war in heaven, through the biotransference and the carnage and the slow, agonizing realization of what he had done to his people, the Silent King had been watching and planning and waiting for exactly the right moment. He knew the Citan could not be destroyed, not truly. They were fundamental aspects of the universe, woven into the fabric of reality itself, and no amount of force could unmake them entirely. But they could be broken. They could be shattered into fragments small enough to be contained. The biotransference process had embedded engrammatic command protocols in every Necron mind, giving Zarek absolute control over his entire species. Now he used that control to orchestrate the greatest betrayal in the history of the galaxy. The Necrons turned on their Citan masters all at once, in a coordinated uprising that the star gods, in their arrogance and their mutual distrust, had never seen coming. Zarek's finest cryptex had secretly developed weapons specifically designed to harm the Citan, hypercannons that focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe into beams capable of fracturing even a star god's essence. The Nightbringer, bloated with the power of consumed brethren and convinced that these weapons were being built as tribute, did not realize its danger until the first hypercannon tore through its necrodermis shell and began to fragment the energy within. One by one, the C'tan were brought low. Each was assailed with the arcane weapons the cryptex had forged. Each was sundered into thousands of smaller, less powerful fragments, and each was bound within a multi-dimensional prison known as a tesseract labyrinth. The process was not easy. The forces unleashed were so extreme that causality itself was damaged, and even the memory of the dreadful weapons used had to be purged from Necron minds afterward, for fear of what might later be done with them. Only one C'tan was not shattered, but completely destroyed. Landugor, the Flayer. The Necrons of the Maynarch dynasty, acting on the Silent King's orders, annihilated the Flayer utterly, an act so extreme that even the other C'tan had not been subjected to it. But the Flayer had just enough awareness in its final moments to lash out with a dying curse that would haunt the Necron species for eternity. "To those who have turned their faces away," Yandugor screamed as its essence unraveled. "To those who are faithless and wretched in their jealousies. To those who have denied me. I will wreak vengeance. I will wrench your souls and break your bones, whilst I will cast hunger through your accursed existence. Down the eons you will not forget. I will grant you this gift from love turned aside and make you like me, break you in my image as you have broken me. I shall cast the fear of myself into you and all of your kind. I am Landugor. I am the hunger. I am the Flayer, and from this moment, you shall be too." The Flayer virus, born from the death throes of a god, spread through the Necron species like a plague. Those infected developed an insatiable hunger for the flesh and blood of living creatures, a grotesque parody of the C'tan's own appetite, and they tore the skin from the living to drape it over their own metallic forms, in a futile attempt to reclaim the biological existence that had been taken from them. These flayed ones, as they came to be known, became the lepers of Necron society, feared and shunned and exiled to the darkest corners of the galaxy. The Flayer's last curse was proof that even a dead god could still inflict suffering on a cosmic scale. The other C'tan were imprisoned, not destroyed. Each was sundered into thousands of shards, fragments of their former selves that retained echoes of their parent entity's power and personality, but were small enough to be contained within the Tesseract labyrinths. These shards were like genies trapped in bottles, still immensely powerful, still capable of manipulating reality in terrifying ways, but bound and fettered and unable to reassemble themselves into the world-eating gods they had once been. The war was over. The C'tan were broken. The old ones were extinct, and the Necrons stood as the undisputed masters of a ruined galaxy. But Zarek took no joy in his victory. Looking upon what remained of his people, upon the soulless automatons that had once been the proud Necrontyr, he felt nothing but the cold weight of failure. The biotransference could not be undone. The souls his people had lost could not be recovered. The Necrons were immortal, yes, but they were also empty, hollow shells going through the motions of existence, without any of the meaning or purpose that had once made life worth living. In an act of penance that would echo through 60 million years, Zarek ordered the Necrons to enter the Great Sleep. Every dynasty, every tomb world, every warrior and lord and cryptek was to enter stasis, hibernating in the depths of their subterranean strongholds while the galaxy healed and new civilizations arose. When the Necrons eventually woke, thus Zarek hoped there might be organic species whose bodies could serve as vessels for Necron consciousness, finally reversing the curse of biotransference. Then, the Silent King severed his own command protocols, giving his subjects free will for the first time since their transformation. And he left. Alone, piloting a single vessel into the intergalactic void, Zarek disappeared from the galaxy, carrying with him the burden of having doomed his entire species and the knowledge that even eternity might not be long enough to make amends. The Necrons slept. The galaxy turned. Civilizations rose and fell and rose again. And in their tesseract labyrinths, the shattered fragments of the Satan dreamed of vengeance. Now, I want to spend some time with the individual Citan, because while the broad strokes of their history are terrifying enough, or it is in the details of each specific star god that the true depth of their horror becomes apparent. Each Citan is unique, with its own personality, its own appetites, and its own particular brand of cruelty. Understanding them individually helps us understand the full scope of what the galaxy faced during the war in heaven, and what it may face again if these beings ever manage to reassemble themselves. Let us begin with the one who started it all. The first, and arguably the most terrible. The being whose very existence planted the seeds of the Necrontyre's downfall 60 million years before the first human drew breath.
Honestly, real talk for a second here, this is what I love about the Catan as a faction in the lore. Games Workshop could have just made them big scary aliens. They could have stopped that ancient war star monsters and called it a day, but what makes the Catan hit different, what makes them stick with you after you close your codex and turn off the screen, is the tragedy underneath it all. These were innocent things once. Mindless, sure, but harmless. Drifting between stars, feeding on light. Bothering nobody, and it was us, or the Necron-tier version of us. A desperate dying civilization that turned them into monsters by giving them bodies and appetites and showing them what cruelty tasted like. The Catan didn't choose to become evil, they were thought, and I think that is way more disturbing than any amount of planet-destroying firepower. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
Let us talk about the Nightbringer. Azagorod, the destroyer of light, the embodiment of death itself. If you have ever experienced a chill down your spine when contemplating your own mortality, if you have ever woken in the dark hours of the night with an inexplicable sense of dread, if you have ever looked at a hooded skeletal figure in a piece of artwork and felt something primal and ancient stir in the depths of your subconscious, then you have felt the Nightbringer's legacy. Because the Nightbringer did something during the war in heaven that no other entity in the entire history of the galaxy has ever accomplished. It reached into the minds of virtually every intelligent species in existence and planted its image there, not as a memory or a thought, but as an instinct, a hardwired, genetic-level response buried so deep in the psyche that billions of years of evolution have not been able to erase it. The Nightbringer is the reason you fear death, not the rational, intellectual understanding that life must end. That is just biology. What the Nightbringer planted is something older and darker, the visceral, gut-churning terror that seizes you when you contemplate the void, the cold sweat that breaks out on your skin when something moves in the darkness. The image of a robed, skeletal figure carrying a scythe that appears in the mythology of virtually every human culture that has ever existed, and in the mythologies of species that have never had contact with humanity. The Grim Reaper is not a myth. It is a memory, a racial memory implanted by a being of incomprehensible power during an era so ancient that the continents of Earth had not yet finished forming. The Nightbringer looked upon the young races of the galaxy and decided that they should fear death, not because fear served any strategic purpose, but because fear tasted better than anything else. A creature that fears death produces stronger electromagnetic signatures, richer life energy, a more satisfying meal when it is finally consumed. The Nightbringer was farming the galaxy, cultivating entire civilizations, to produce the specific emotional frequency that it found most delicious. Only one species escaped this psychic imprinting, the orcs, or more precisely, the Krork, the proto-orc species, created by the Old Ones during the war in heaven. The Krork did not fear death. They could not be made to fear death. Something in their psychology, perhaps the same quality that makes modern orcs charge into battle with joyous enthusiasm regardless of the odds, rendered them immune to the Nightbringer's influence. Every other intelligent species in the galaxy carries the Nightbringer's mark somewhere in the recesses of its collective unconscious. The Nightbringer's physical form reflected its nature. In its necrodermis shell, it appeared as a towering skeletal figure draped in a cloak of living darkness, carrying a massive scythe that could cut through the fabric of reality itself. This was not coincidence. The Nightbringer shaped its own appearance to maximize the terror it produced, crafting an image of death so perfect and so universal that it became the template for every death god in every religion across the galaxy. When humans speak of the Grim Reaper, they are describing a being they have never seen, but somehow, impossibly, remember. In combat, the Nightbringer was catastrophically powerful. It could destroy star systems on a whim, or extinguishing suns and shattering worlds with the casual indifference of a child knocking over sandcastles. It fed on the death agonies of billions, gorging itself on suffering so vast that even the Drukhari, those masters of torment, could not match its excesses. Its scythe, the Satan Phase scythe, was a weapon of such terrifying power that the Old Ones and their Eldari allies devoted enormous resources to banishing it to the warp, recognizing that as long as the Nightbringer wielded it, no army in the galaxy could stand against it. During the War in Heaven, the Nightbringer achieved something else of enormous significance. It fought the Eldari war god, Kayla Mensha Kana, in single combat. The details of this battle are preserved in Eldari mythology as the birth of fear, and while the Nightbringer ultimately lost the engagement, yes, it managed to wound Kane, a feat that speaks to the staggering scale of power we are discussing. This was a Citan, fighting a god of the warp, a being of pure physical reality against a being of pure psychic energy, and both came away damaged. When the Necrons finally turned on their masters, the Nightbringer was among the most difficult to bring down. Its shards, the fragments of its essence scattered across thousands of tesseract labyrinths, remain the most dangerous and difficult to control of all the imprisoned Satan. Somewhere within those fragments, deep in the crystal matrices of their prisons, the memories of the Nightbringer persist. It remembers what it was, it remembers what it did, and it has had 60 million years to think about what it will do when it gets free. As shards of the Nightbringer have been encountered on multiple occasions in the 41st Millennium, and every encounter has been a catastrophe. Even a single shard, a fragment representing only the tiniest fraction of the Nightbringer's original power, is capable of wiping out armies and destroying cities. When a shard of the Nightbringer walks onto a battlefield, it does so as a towering figure of darkness and silver, its scythe singing through the air, its very presence causing hardened warriors to collapse in terror as 60-million-year-old instincts scream at them to run. One of the most famous encounters occurred on the world of Pavonis, where a shard of the Nightbringer was inadvertently awakened by a corrupt Imperial administrator named Kashmir de Valtos. The Ultramarines' 4th Company, under Captain Uriel Ventris, Bao was sent to deal with the situation and found themselves facing a being of nightmarish power. The Nightbringer slaughtered most of the opposing forces with contemptuous ease, and it was only through Ventris's willingness to threaten mutual destruction, to stare into the face of death incarnate and refuse to flinch, that the shard was temporarily driven back. It is a testament to the Nightbringer's enduring danger that even a fragment of its consciousness remains one of the most dangerous entities in the galaxy. Now let us turn to the Star God, who is, in many ways, the Nightbringer's opposite. Where the Nightbringer embodies the brute, overwhelming power of death, this next Satan embodies something far more insidious, something that slithers into the cracks of civilizations and pulls them apart from the inside. Something that smiles at you and speaks in a voice like honey while it signs the death warrant of your entire species. Let us talk about Mephetron, the messenger, the jackal god, the greatest liar the galaxy has ever known, the deceiver. If the Nightbringer is the hammer, the deceiver is the stiletto. If the Nightbringer is the earthquake, the deceiver is the termite that has been silently eating through the foundations for years before the building finally collapses. The deceiver does not destroy civilizations through force. It destroys them through trust. It finds what you want most desperately, what you would do anything to achieve, and it offers it to you with a smile that never quite reaches its eyes. The deceiver was never the most physically powerful of the Citan. In terms of raw destructive capability, yes, it was actually one of the weakest. But it was, without question, the most dangerous. Because the deceiver understood something that its brethren did not, that intelligence is a weapon, that information is power, and that a lie told at the right moment to the right person can cause more devastation than a supernova. We have already discussed how the deceiver orchestrated the biotransference of the Necrontire, how it came before the Silent King speaking honeyed platitudes and half-truths, how it concealed the true cost of immortality behind a wall of carefully constructed promises. But that was just the beginning. The deceiver's manipulations extended far beyond the Necrontire. It was the deceiver, according to some accounts, who first convinced the Satan to devour one another. By whispering to the Nightbringer and others that the life energy of their fellow star gods was the richest feast available, the deceiver triggered the catastrophic infighting that nearly destroyed the Citan from within. And while greater beings tore each other apart, the deceiver slipped between the cracks, avoiding the violence, gathering allies, playing all sides against each other with a skill that would make any mortal politician weep with envy. Among the other Satan, the deceiver's reputation became toxic. They learned to distrust it, to shun its company, to suspect every word that came from its mouth. But by the time they caught on, the damage was already done. The Satan's unified front had been shattered, their collective strength diminished by internal warfare, and the path had been cleared for the Necrons' eventual rebellion. Even the deceiver's shattering at the hands of the Necrons is surrounded by uncertainty. Was it truly caught off guard? Did the singing spheres that tore it apart genuinely take it by surprise? Or was the shattering itself part of some deeper plan, a scheme so elaborate that even being broken into thousands of fragments was just another move on a board game being played across millennia? There is evidence to support the latter interpretation. In the millennia since its shattering, shards of the deceiver have displayed a disturbing level of coherence and purpose. Unlike the fragments of other Satan, which tend to act on instinct or dim echoes of their former personalities, shards of the deceiver seem to operate with intelligence and deliberation. They infiltrate civilizations. They assume identities. They play the long game. Well, one particularly chilling account involves a shard of the deceiver that managed to assume the identity of a planetary governor within the Imperium of Man. When a Calidus assassin, one of the Imperium's elite shape-shifting killers, was sent to eliminate the governor, she struck with her Citan phase knife, a weapon forged from the same living metal as the Citan's own bodies. The blade passed straight through the governor's body, without leaving a mark. The deceiver, for that is what the governor was, simply knocked the assassin aside, picked up the weapon, and absorbed it into its hand, as though welcoming home a lost piece of itself. Then it commented that the assassin's polymorphine drug, the shape-shifting compound that allowed Calidus operatives to assume any form, gave human essence such a delicate flavoring. Another shard managed to assume the identity of Omegon, one of the twin primarchs of the Alpha Legion, and used this disguise to manipulate scattered warbands of Alpha Legion Chaos Space Marines into constructing anti-warp pylons in an uncharted region at the galaxy's core. The shard's goal was nothing less than closing the Great Rift, the massive tear in reality that currently splits the galaxy in two, and then tricking humanity into entering biotransference furnaces, just as the Necronter had been tricked millions of years before. It was only through the intervention of a renegade Alpha Legionnaire named Occam the Untrue that this scheme was uncovered, and the shard imprisoned within a tesseract labyrinth. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that the deceiver's shattering was intentional. If each shard retains the deceiver's intelligence and capacity for manipulation, then being broken into thousands of pieces means being in thousands of places at once. The deceiver went from being one supremely cunning entity to being a vast network of supremely cunning entities, each operating independently, but all sharing the same fundamental nature. Every shard is a spy. Every shard is an infiltrator. Every shard is a scheme waiting to unfold. An ancient Aeldari prophecy speaks of the deceiver's return in terms that are both cryptic and deeply unsettling. And the jackal god shall turn brother against brother. Given the deceiver's track record, this is less a prophecy and more a statement of established operating procedure. The deceiver is the Citan that keeps inquisitors awake at night, not the Nightbringer, whose threat is obvious and direct, not the Void Dragon, whose imprisonment is at least theoretically secure. The deceiver. Because you can fight a monster, you can build walls against a force of nature, but how do you defend against an enemy who might already be sitting next to you, wearing the face of your most trusted ally, speaking in a voice that you have known and trusted for decades? How do you protect yourself from a liar who has been perfecting the art of deception for longer than your entire species has existed? You cannot. And the deceiver knows it. That knowledge is the source of whatever passes for a smile on its ancient, living metal face. But let us also consider the deceiver's manipulations within the Imperium itself more broadly. There is an Aeldari artifact translation that warns of the deceiver's influence in harrowing terms. It speaks of the deceiver blurring the sight of the younger races, of making humanity believe they are coming home, when in fact they are walking into the Necron soul forges. This is not a vague or metaphorical warning. This is a specific, targeted prophecy about the deceiver doing to humanity exactly what it did to the Necron 60 million years ago. The same trick, the same lie, the same harvest. The Sylvae are a case study in the deceiver's methods on a smaller scale. This was an agrarian society with little technology, a peaceful civilization that the deceiver visited early in their development. It convinced them to worship it, to structure their entire culture around its veneration, and then it introduced them to the Imperium. Contact with the Imperium's violent culture caused the Sylvae to turn to violence themselves, and when they began to slip back into what the deceiver considered barbarism when they failed to develop in the way it wanted, the deceiver did not try to guide them back onto the path. It simply sent its Necrons to exterminate them all. The few survivors had insufficient genetic diversity to continue the species. The deceiver had created a civilization, shaped it, and then destroyed it when it ceased to be useful, with no more emotion than a human might feel when throwing away a tool that had broken. This pattern of creating and discarding civilizations is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the deceiver's nature. It does not merely use existing civilizations as tools. It creates new ones, custom-built to serve specific purposes, and then discards them when those purposes have been served. How many civilizations in the galaxy's long history owe their existence to the deceiver's interference? How many rose and fell without ever knowing that their entire culture was an experiment, a prototype, a rough draft for some scheme that the deceiver had been planning for millions of years? We will never know, and that uncertainty is itself a weapon in the deceiver's arsenal. Now we come to the most powerful of all the Citan, the one whose mere existence may have shaped the course of human civilization in ways that no one fully understands. We come to Magladroth, the dragon, the master of the material realm, the entity that some believe is the true machine god worshipped by the trillions of tech priests in the Adeptus Mechanicus. We come to the Void Dragon. If the Nightbringer is the Citan of death and the deceiver is the Citan of lies, then the Void Dragon is the Citan of technology itself. In Aeldari mythology, Magladroth is portrayed as a figure of oblivion, wanton destruction, and devastation, a force of nature that embodied the terrifying potential of the material universe to unmake itself. Its warriors during the war in heaven were described as practically invincible, beings that could channel lightning into their foes with a power that the Aeldari had no answer for until they hastily created specialized constructs known as the Iron Knights to stand against them. The Void Dragon was, by virtually all accounts, the greatest and most terrible of all the Catan. While the Nightbringer was the most feared, and the Deceiver the most cunning, The Void Dragon was simply the most powerful. It had an innate mastery over the material realm that surpassed even its brethren, an ability to manipulate technology and physical matter with a precision and scope that made the other Citan's powers seem crude by comparison. This mastery manifested in several ways during the War in Heaven. The Void Dragon created the most advanced weapons and warriors among the Citan's forces. The technology it conceived, which the Necrons then built and deployed, included many of the most devastating tools in the Necron arsenal. Even the pylons that the Citan had the Necrons construct on Cadia and across other worlds, those devices designed to seal off the warp from the material universe, may have originated from the Void Dragon's designs. These pylons, made of a mysterious substance called noctilith, could enhance or shut down psychic powers and, when activated in sufficient numbers, could cut entire regions of space off from the Imperium. But the truly extraordinary aspect of the Void Dragon's story is what happened after the shattering. Because while most Citan were imprisoned by the Necrons in Tesseract labyrinths, the Void Dragon's fate may have been something altogether different. According to a convergence of legends, myths, and suppressed historical records, a shard of the Void Dragon, possibly a very large and powerful shard, somehow ended up on a planet that humans call Mars. The story goes like this. In the distant past, long before the Age of Strife, long before the Imperium of Man, the being who would become the Emperor of mankind encountered the Void Dragon, or a shard of it on Terra itself. In one account, this encounter took place during the era of the Roman Empire, when the Emperor was living under a mortal identity as a soldier serving the Emperor Diocletian. The Void Dragon, weakened by its shattering and its infighting with other Catan, had been hiding on Terra, and the future Emperor challenged it to single combat. The battle was titanic. The dragon's scales, described as silver in color, harder than steel yet rippling like liquid mercury when struck, bore all the hallmarks of necrodermis. The light of devoured stars shone from its breast. It fought with a ferocity born of billions of years of existence. But the Emperor, wielding his psychic powers with a skill that even a Catan could not fully counter, managed to defeat it. But he did not destroy it. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he did not want to. Instead, yet the Emperor imprisoned the Void Dragon beneath the surface of Mars, in a location that would later be known as the Noctis Labyrinthus, and there it has remained, sleeping and dreaming, for thousands of years. Here is where the story becomes truly staggering in its implications. Because Mars is not just any planet, Mars is the homeworld of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the vast techno-religious organization that maintains and develops all of the Imperium's technology. The Adeptus Mechanicus worships a deity they call the Machine God, or the Omnissiah, a divine intelligence that they believe resides within all technology and guides their hands as they work. What if the Machine God is real? What if it is not a metaphor or a religious construct, but an actual entity sleeping beneath the red sands of Mars? He is subtly influencing the minds of every tech priest who has ever said a prayer over a cogitator or anointed a machine spirit with sacred oils. What if the Machine God is the Void Dragon? The evidence, while circumstantial, is compelling. The Void Dragon has a documented ability to influence and manipulate technology. Its presence on Mars predates the founding of the Mechanicum by millennia. The devotion of the tech priests to their Machine God, their willingness to replace their own flesh with metal, their obsession with the perfection of the machine, all of this mirrors the Citan's own nature and the process of biotransference that the Catan inflicted on the Necron Tyre. In 998 of the 41st Millennium, 5 Necron Shroud-class light cruisers launched a suicide attack on Mars itself, penetrating the planet's formidable defenses and landing near the Noctis Labyrinthus before they were destroyed. Their objective was never determined, but the location of their attack is suggestive. Were they trying to free the Void Dragon? Were they trying to destroy it? Were they acting on orders from a Necron dynasty, or on the whispered commands of a Citan shard that had found a way to communicate with its imprisoned master? The answers remain unknown. but the questions themselves are enough to keep the Inquisition awake at night. A Titan shard of the Void Dragon that escaped from the Arotepk dynasty's imprisonment in the 41st millennium demonstrates just how dangerous even a fragment of this entity can be. This single shard proceeded to ravage a dozen Necron worlds before it was recaptured, as gorging itself on the living metal of the very civilization that had once served it. The cryptex of the Arotepk dynasty, some of the most skilled engineers in the Necron Empire, could barely contain this one fragment, and the effort cost them dearly. If a single shard can wreak that kind of devastation upon a civilization of living metal beings who are specifically designed to contain Satan, imagine what the full power of the Void Dragon could do if it were ever to awaken and reassemble itself from its scattered fragments. And think about where its largest known fragment is sleeping. Not on some forgotten tomb world in the outer reaches of the galaxy, not in the depths of space where it might cause harm only to the void. It is sleeping beneath the surface of Mars, the heart of the Imperium's industrial might. Yet the home world of every tech priest, every forge, every factory that keeps the Imperium's armies supplied with weapons and armor and ammunition. If the Void Dragon were to wake, truly wake, on Mars, the consequences would be beyond catastrophic. The entire logistical backbone of the Imperium of man could be compromised in an instant. There is a guardian, of course, a keeper who watches over the dragon's prison and ensures that it does not escape. The Emperor himself appointed the first guardian and gave them a portion of his power to sustain the vigil. When one guardian's mortal body fails, that power is passed to the next, an unbroken chain of sentinels stretching back thousands of years to the day the Emperor sealed the dragon beneath the Martian sands. The current keeper is said to be a woman named Dahlia Cythera, who assumed the role during the tumultuous era of the Horus heresy. But how long can one guardian, however empowered, stand against a being that was ancient when the stars were young? How long before the wards fail, or the chain of succession is broken, or some cosmic event weakens the prison just enough for the thing inside to push its way free? The Necrons have not forgotten what sleeps beneath Mars. Those 5 Shroud-class cruisers that penetrated the defenses of humanity's most heavily fortified world and landed near the Noctis Labyrinthus were not on a random mission. They went to Mars for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was important enough to sacrifice 5 warships and their crews to accomplish. The relationship between the Void Dragon and the Adeptus Mechanicus goes deeper than simple proximity. The very culture of the Mechanicus, their reverence for the machine, their willingness to replace their own flesh with metal and circuit, their belief that the spirit of the Omnissiah dwells within every piece of technology, mirrors the Satan's own nature and the process of biotransference in ways that are too precise to be coincidental. The tech priests of Mars worship a machine god that, if it exists, is not a benevolent deity, but a cosmic predator that was imprisoned beneath their feet by the Emperor of mankind. Their entire religion may be the long-term psychic influence of a sleeping god, a subtle manipulation that has been reshaping human technology and culture for millennia without anyone realizing it. And if there is one thing that the lore of the Citan teaches us, it is that their influence does not require consciousness. But the Nightbringer planted the fear of death in the collective unconscious of every intelligent species in the galaxy, and that implant has persisted for 60 million years without maintenance. The Void Dragon's influence over Mars may be operating on a similar principle, a psychic broadcast so deep and so fundamental that it shapes the thoughts and beliefs of everyone within range without their knowledge or consent. Some scholars have even speculated that the Void Dragon's influence may have extended to the Primarchs themselves, those 20 demigod sons of the Emperor who led his great crusade to unite humanity. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, was known for his obsessive relationship with technology and his willingness to replace his own flesh with metal, in traits that echo the biotransference process with uncomfortable precision. Was Ferrus Manus influenced by the Void Dragon's proximity during his time in the Sol system? Was his philosophy of the flesh being weak and the machine being strong a natural personality trait? Or was it the whispered suggestion of something sleeping beneath the red sands of the planet next door? These questions have no definitive answers. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling thing about the Void Dragon. Unlike the Nightbringer, whose threat is straightforward, and the Deceiver, whose schemes at least follow a comprehensible logic, the Void Dragon's influence is so subtle and so pervasive that it is impossible to determine where it ends and where normal human behavior begins. Every prayer offered to the machine god, every sacred oil anointed upon a cogitator, and every binary cant spoken by a tech priest over a newly forged weapon might be an act of worship directed at a sleeping monster. Or it might not. There is no way to know. And the Void Dragon, if it is aware at all in its slumber, is content to let the ambiguity persist. Now let us venture to the darkest edges of the galaxy, past the spiral arms and the halo stars, out into the cold void between galaxies where light itself seems to falter and fail. Let us speak of the Satan that even other Catan fear. Let us speak of Tsaranoga, the outsider. If the other Catan are nightmares, the outsider is the nightmare that nightmares have. The outsider's story is, in its own way, the most tragic of all the Satan's histories. Like its brethren, what if the outsider was tricked into consuming other Satan during the cannibalistic frenzy that tore their pantheon apart? But where the Nightbringer seemed to relish the experience and emerged from it simply hungrier than before, the outsider was fundamentally broken by what it had done. The account preserved in Eldari legend tells of a duel between the outsider and Segorak, the laughing god of the Harlequins. As the outsider, accompanied by 4 lesser Catan, moved through the galaxy devouring stars, Segorak appeared before it as a challenge. The laughing god, that eternal trickster, cast illusions upon the lesser Catan that accompanied the outsider, making them appear to be something other than what they were. The outsider, confused by the deception and hungry for power, devoured its companions one by one. And then something happened that had never happened to any other Satan. The fragments of consciousness belonging to the devoured entities did not simply dissipate. They persisted within the outsider, like shards of glass embedded in flesh, and they began to talk. Every Satan the outsider had consumed retained a ghost of its awareness, a fragment of its personality, and these fragments clawed and whispered and screamed inside the outsider's mind without cease. The consumed gods did not die. They raged. They mourned. They demanded release. The outsider went insane, clutching its head, spasming with the agony of 100 warring consciousnesses trapped within a single entity. The outsider folded in upon itself and grew dim. It screamed with a voice that resonated across dimensions, yet the sound that drove every living thing within range to madness or suicide. Those who came near it took their own lives rather than endure its presence. Its gaze caused despair so total that even the bravest warriors could not meet it and retain their sanity. And then the outsider left, not because it was driven out, but because the horror of its own existence had become too much to bear in the company of others. It fled the populated regions of the galaxy and retreated to the void beyond the edges of known space, where it now dwells in isolation, feeding once more on stars, as the Satan did in the earliest days of the universe, and fighting an endless internal war against the fragments of consciousness that will never let it rest. A deep scan image captured by Imperial sensors shows an object to the galactic south, beyond the edge of the Milky Way itself. This object has an estimated diameter of 1.04 astronomical units, roughly the distance from Earth to the Sun. It appears to be a structure of some kind, possibly a Dyson sphere or something analogous, and it is large enough to completely encase a star. This object is not listed in any Imperial database. No expedition has ever been sent to investigate it. And Hive Fleet Leviathan, one of the largest Tyranid invasion fleets ever recorded, changed course to avoid it. The Tyranids, those mindless, ravenous organisms that will consume anything in their path, went around this object rather than through it. Think about what that means. The tyrannid hive mind, an intelligence that spans entire fleets and thinks nothing of hurling billions of organisms at fortified worlds, has calculated that whatever was inside that structure was more dangerous than whatever it might gain by consuming it. The tyrannids, who fear nothing, were afraid. A mad heretic named Corteswain, interrogated by the Inquisition, claimed to have seen the Lord of Insanity dwelling in a world within a world. Farthest Maichu of Ulthwé described in a vision of universal doom the writhing, inverted geometries of the outsider as it curled and tightened around its harvest, its prey trapped in an illogical labyrinth from which there was no escape, their sanity long since shattered by the mere proximity of the insane god. Some have speculated that the outsider may be the force behind the tyrannid invasions, the intelligence guiding the hive fleets toward the Milky Way. This theory suggests that the outsider, in its madness, is using the tyrannids as a weapon to destroy the galaxy that caused its suffering, or perhaps to herd living creatures toward it, the way a fisherman herds fish into a net. The theory is unproven and controversial, but the coincidence of the tyrannid's arrival and the outsider's known location at the galaxy's edge is, at the very least, deeply uncomfortable. What makes the outsider particularly terrifying is the possibility that, unlike most of the other Satan, it may never have been shattered. While the standard law states that the Necrons broke every Satan they could reach, there are persistent rumors that the outsider escaped this fate. It may have gone into self-imposed exile before the Necron rebellion, too broken and too dangerous for even the Silent King to confront. According to the Book of Mournful Night, and held in the Ael Dari Black Library, the outsider may remain the sole intact Satan, having become too terrible in its madness to be defeated. If that is the case, then the outsider is the last fully intact Catan in existence, a being of original, undiminished power that has been sitting at the galaxy's edge for 60 million years, growing madder and madder, while the voices of consumed gods scream endlessly inside its head. Try to comprehend what that means. Every other major Citan has been broken into shards, fragments that retain only a fraction of their original power. The outsider, if it is indeed whole, possesses the full, undiminished might of a star god, plus whatever power it absorbed from the Citan it consumed. It is, potentially, the single most powerful entity in the material universe, and it is completely, irretrievably insane. The nature of the outsider's madness is itself a subject of horrified fascination. This is not the kind of insanity that makes a being unpredictable or irrational in a human sense. This is something far more alien and far more total. The outsider's consciousness is a battlefield where the fragments of devoured gods wage an eternal civil war. Every thought is contested. Every impulse is contradicted by a dozen competing wills. The outsider cannot act coherently because it is not one being. It is dozens of beings, each fighting for control of the same cosmic body, each screaming its own desires and fears and hatreds into a shared mental space that has been reverberating with these conflicting voices for 60 million years without pause. Farthest Maichu of Ulthwé, as one of the most powerful psychers in the Eldari craft worlds, experienced a vision of the outsider's domain and described it in terms that suggest a being operating on principles that defy ordinary physics. The writhing, inverted geometries of the outsider, she said, curled and tightened around its harvest. Its prey had long since lost their sanity, save for the false hope that they might escape. The outsider's domain is described as an illogical labyrinth, a space where the normal rules of reality do not apply, where geometry bends in directions that should not exist, where escape is not merely difficult, but conceptually impossible. This description of inverted geometries and illogical spaces is particularly disturbing because it suggests that the outsider's madness has become externalized, that its fractured consciousness has warped the very fabric of space around it. The outsider does not merely exist in its prison sphere. It has reshaped the space around it into something that reflects its own mental state, a physical manifestation of insanity that drives anyone who enters it to the same madness that consumes its creator. The connection between the outsider and the Tyranids remains one of the most provocative and controversial theories in Warhammer 40,000 lore. On one hand, the Citan operate entirely within the material universe and have no connection to the warp, while the Tyranid hive mind appears to operate at least partially through psychic phenomena, which would seem to rule out Citan involvement. On the other hand, the Tyranids' arrival from outside the galaxy, their trajectory, and their documented avoidance of whatever lurks in that massive spherical object at the galaxy's edge are all suspicious coincidences. Some theorists suggest that the outsider may not be controlling the Tyranids directly, but rather acting as a kind of psychic lure, a beacon of such overwhelming wrongness that it attracted the attention of the hive fleets from across the intergalactic void. Others propose that the outsider, in its madness, may have found a way to project its influence through the material universe rather than the warp, using gravitational or electromagnetic signals to guide the Tyranids toward the galaxy as a weapon to use against the Necrons who imprisoned its brethren. Still others suggest that the connection is purely coincidental, and that the Tyranids' avoidance of the outsider's sphere is simply the pragmatic calculation of a predator that recognizes a more dangerous predator and steers clear. Whatever the truth, the outsider represents a sword of Damocles hanging over the galaxy. If it is indeed the last whole Citan, and if it ever manages to overcome its madness long enough to act with purpose, the consequences would be beyond anything the galaxy has faced. Even the other Citan feared the outsider. Even the Nightbringer, that remorseless engine of death, kept its distance. Even the Deceiver, that master manipulator who could talk circles around gods, did not dare to try its tricks on the outsider. Because you cannot deceive madness. You cannot reason with a mind that contains a dozen warring gods. And you certainly cannot fight something that has been stewing in its own cosmic insanity for 60 million years and has only grown more powerful and more unhinged with every passing eon. The outsider is the wild card, the unknown variable, the thing that keeps the Aeldari Farseers staring into the depths of their spirit stones with expressions of quiet, resigned horror. Because when the outsider moves, and eventually it will move, nothing in the galaxy will be prepared for what comes. Beyond the four great Citan that have dominated the lore, the Nightbringer, the Deceiver, the Void Dragon, and the Outsider, there were many others. The original Citan pantheon was vast, comprising dozens, if not hundreds of individual entities, most of which were consumed by their fellows during the cannibalistic wars that ravaged their kind. But a few others have left their marks on history, and they deserve mention here. Nyadra Zatha, the Burning One, was a Catan of fire and destruction who found great joy in setting things ablaze. The Burning One is significant in the lore because it was this entity that showed the Necrons how to access the webway, the ancient network of extra-dimensional tunnels created by the Old Ones. The Burning One desired to bring its eldritch flames into the webway itself, to set alight the pathways between worlds, and it taught the Necrons to construct dolmen gates, crude portals that punched through the walls of the webway and allowed Necron forces to enter. This was crucial because the Necrons, lacking any psychic ability whatsoever, could not travel through the warp. The dolmen gates gave them an alternative means of rapid interstellar travel, as albeit one that angered the Aeldari tremendously, as the webway was theirs by right of inheritance from the Old Ones. Shards of the Burning One have been encountered in the 41st Millennium. One was discovered by the infamous Necron collector, Trazyn the Infinite, on the world of Midgardia, one of the planets of the Fenris system, and was subsequently added to Trazyn's vast galleries of stolen artifacts on the tomb world of Solemnice. Another shard of the Burning One is used to power the Silent King's own personal vehicle, the Dais of Dominion. Yes, you heard that correctly. Sarek, the being who led the rebellion against the Satan, who shattered the star gods and imprisoned them in tesseract labyrinths, now rides into battle atop a throne, powered by a captive fragment of one of those very gods. Yes, it is perhaps the most brutally ironic fate that any deity has ever suffered. Iashudra, the Endless Swarm, is another Khatan, whose name survives in the records. Little is known about this entity beyond its name and its association with overwhelming numbers, but the Silent King himself cursed its name alongside the Nightbringer and the Deceiver, suggesting that the Endless Swarm played a significant role in the suffering of the Necrontyr. Igranya, the Moulder of Worlds, is perhaps most famous for its connection to one of the most terrifying weapons in Necron history, the World Engine. This was a tomb world that had been converted into a mobile battle station of phenomenal power, capable of destroying entire planets and shrugging off firepower that would annihilate a fleet. A shard of Igranya was used to power the World Engine's systems, its reality-shaping abilities harnessed to fuel weapons that could reshape geography from orbit. Ogdriada, the Arisen, Kalagura, the Silent Cry, Zahulash, the Potentate, and others round out the known roster of Satan, each with fragmentary mentions in the lore that hint at powers and personalities that may never be fully explored. The names alone are evocative. The Silent Cry, a Satan whose very voice was a weapon. The Potentate, a Satan of domination and authority. The Arisen, a Satan associated with resurrection or emergence. Each name is a story waiting to be told, a horror waiting to be unleashed. And now we come to the present day, or what passes for the present in a galaxy where time itself has been damaged by the forces unleashed during the war in heaven. And the 41st Millennium, the era of the Imperium of man, of the Aeldari's slow decline, of the Orcs' endless wars, of the Tyrannid threat, and the Chaos God's eternal machinations. An era in which the Necrons are waking from their great sleep and discovering that the galaxy they left behind has changed in ways they could never have anticipated. And they are bringing their Satan shards with them. In the modern era, Satan shards are among the most devastating weapons in the Necron arsenal. Each shard is contained within a tesseract labyrinth, a small, unassuming cube about the size of a closed fist that is, in reality, the physical manifestation of a pocket-dimensional prison. Within this extra-dimensional space, the shard exists in a state of contained fury, its immense power bound by the hyperdimensional geometry of its prison. When the Necrons deem the situation dire enough to warrant their deployment, the Tesseract labyrinths are opened and the shards are released upon the battlefield. Even in their reduced and fettered state, Satan shards are beings of near unlimited power. They can manifest energy blasts that vaporize armored columns. They can control the minds of lesser beings, turning enemies against their own allies. They can manipulate the flow of time, aging opponents to dust in seconds, or hurling them backward through the temporal stream. They can banish foes to alternate dimensions from which there is no return. A Satan shard's abilities are limited only by its imagination, which is immense, and by glimmering memories of the being from which it was severed. The recorded abilities of Satan shards include some of the most terrifying powers in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Antimatter meteors, balls of annihilating energy hurled from orbit, cosmic fire, flames that burn at temperatures beyond mortal comprehension, entropic touch, the ability to cause metal to decay and crumble at a touch, the gaze of death, which drains the life from everything in the vicinity, the Moulder of Worlds, which causes the very ground to buckle and heave, showering enemies with boulders and magma, the Sentient Singularity, which destabilizes local gravitational forces and disrupts teleportation and warp travel, and most terrifying of all, Time's Arrow, which does not merely kill the target, but erases its very existence from the fabric of space-time, removing it not just from the present, but from every moment in which it ever existed. These are the powers of fragments, of broken pieces, of shards of shattered gods. Consider what the Satan could do when they were whole, and the scale of power we are discussing becomes dizzying. More powerful still are the transcendent Catan, aggregations of anywhere between 12 and 100 lesser shards that have been combined into a single entity of near omnipotent power. These transcendent Satan are too powerful to be contained within a tesseract labyrinth. Instead, they are imprisoned within massive Necron constructs called tesseract vaults, monolithic, near indestructible machines that serve as both prison and weapon. Within the vault's heart, the transcendent Satan fights ceaselessly against its bonds, generating energies so extreme that the walls of the vault are perpetually being destroyed and rebuilt by armies of canoptech maintenance constructs. When deployed in battle, a tesseract vault is a weapon of apocalyptic power. The transcendent Satan within can age foes to dust, set entire battlefields ablaze, or trigger seismic shifts in the planetary crust with a gesture. In extreme situations, the Necrons may even release the transcendent Satan from its vault entirely, allowing it to rampage across the battlefield in all its unleashed fury, though this is a decision that is almost as dangerous for the Necrons as it is for their enemies. The foes of the Necrons, in the 41st Millennium, have so far encountered shards of only a few specific Satan, primarily those of the Nightbringer and the Deceiver. But the Necron dynasties possess countless shards, imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths scattered across thousands of tomb worlds. As more Necrons awaken from the Great Sleep, more shards will be deployed, and the galaxy will face threats that it has not seen since the War in Heaven. And there is always the possibility, however remote, that a Satan shard will escape its imprisonment, that it will find other shards of the same parent entity and merge with them. That, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, one of the old gods will reassemble itself, growing stronger with each addition, until what steps forth from the ruins of its prison is no longer a shard, but a star god, reborn and furious and hungry beyond all imagining. If that day ever comes, the galaxy will face a threat that dwarfs the Chaos Gods, the Tyranids, and every other danger it has ever known. Because the Chaos Gods, for all their power, exist in the warp. Their influence on reality is limited by the barrier between dimensions. The Tyranids, for all their numbers, are mortal creatures that can be killed. A fully reconstituted Satan would be a being of limitless power within the material universe, a being that can extinguish stars and devour worlds, a being that shaped the evolution of every intelligent species in the galaxy and planted the fear of death so deep in their genetic code that 60 million years of evolution has not been able to remove it. The Satan are broken, but they are not dead. They cannot die. They are part of the fundamental fabric of reality itself, woven into the laws of physics as deeply and as permanently as gravity and electromagnetism. But they have been shattered and imprisoned and forced to serve as weapons for the very species they once enslaved. But they remember what they were. Every shard carries within it the echo of a god's consciousness, the memory of a power so vast that it could casually rewrite the laws of nature. And somewhere, in a tesseract labyrinth on a forgotten tomb world deep beneath the surface of a planet that no one has visited in 60 million years, a fragment of the Nightbringer dreams of darkness. A fragment of the Deceiver plots its escape. A fragment of the Void Dragon reaches out with invisible tendrils of influence, touching the minds of tech priests who will never know that the prayers they whisper are being heard by something far older and far more terrible than any god they could imagine. The Satan are patient. And they have always been patient. They were born with the universe, and they will be here when it dies. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the oldest monsters of all are still waiting, still watching, still hungry. That is the story of the Satan, the star gods, the star vampires, the beings who were born as mindless parasites on the surfaces of newborn suns and became the most terrible forces the galaxy has ever known. They shaped the Necrons. They destroyed the Old Ones. They planted the fear of death in the DNA of every intelligent species in existence. They fought a war so devastating that it cracked the barrier between reality and the warp and laid the groundwork for every horror that has followed. And they are not finished. The next time you feel a chill at the thought of your own mortality, the next time you wake in the darkness with a sense of dread that has no name and no explanation, remember that what you are feeling is not a trick of your imagination. It is a memory planted by a being of incomprehensible power in an era so ancient that the rocks of your world had not yet cooled. A being that wanted you to feel exactly this way, because fear made you taste better. Sleep well, everyone. And if you enjoyed this journey into the deepest and oldest horrors of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, please do hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We have so many more stories to tell, so many more dark corners of this galaxy to explore together. Every like and every subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you content like this. So thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.